Hello, everyone. This is going to be my uh, Batman Arkham City Turing Machine project, part three of workshop three. Sorry. Pardon my voice. I'm still getting over a upper respiratory infection, but we're gonna try to power through. um, so I wanted to go back to my previous slideshow um, in order to kind of recap what I've been doing here. So I'll get right into it. As you might have remembered from my previous installment, I had implemented a memory stack in order to keep count of, actually, I'll just go to this one. Previously, I could not keep count of remaining enemies with the DFA. Now, the PDA would push an X onto the stack for every enemy that enters the fight. And then it would pop an X off of the stack every time Batman took down an enemy. Meaning that the encounter would end when the stack was empty, when the stack was empty and the state was in Q5, meaning that the prospective enemy had been taken down. The other option was that Batman died and all the enemies there were still enemies remaining, and meaning the stack was not empty. The difference here is that I'm representing a mode called Endless Night, which Endless Night is a mode. It's a special mode in the game where Batman fights an indefinite number of enemies, aka an endless mode. And every time the number of enemies remaining gets low enough, like 3 or 4 enemies remaining, for instance, a new wave is spawned in. And so essentially the only way this encounter will end is when Batman is defeated by the enemies. So it's a really good way to test the player and how long they'd be able to last if there was no end to the enemies coming at them. And I thought it would be fun to represent this in a Turing machine setting, because then you could keep track of how many enemies you had actually defeated by the end of it. And I'll get into that, how I did that in a second here. But the alphabet, as I previously mentioned, has actually changed since the last video. What I mean by this is I removed previously G was actually for if Batman took down the prospective enemy. So the reason I removed this, or replaced it rather, is because it became redundant, and also an important thing I didn't mention before. This TM project, this Turing machine project, is not from the perspective of one enemy as my 2 previous ones were. This is actually from the perspective of all enemies, if that makes sense. It's from a wider perspective of the whole fight. So I did add 1 letter to the alphabet that is acceptable for input, and that is S, which is for when an enemy spawns in. So that is when an enemy spawns in manually by the user's input. There's also a way that when the number gets low enough, there will be an enemy that spawns in automatically, or a group of enemies rather. But this was a good way to kind of update the alphabet to be along the lines of what I wanted to do with the Turing machine. And then my language definition hasn't changed too much, except that the language is the set of all strings in X, such that X is a combination of takedowns or maneuvers, which ends with the defeat of Batman. Previously, this included or the takedown of all enemies, but now there is no all enemies. There could be infinity enemies, and the encounter would still not be over. So that's pretty much all that has changed since my PDA. So I will get straight into JFlap. I also have a notepad document here with my alphabet and the test string I'm going to put in. But this is my states have also changed a bit. So Q0 is here, and this is the initial or patrolling state. Let me actually do this. It's better. The The unalerted patrolling state is Q1. The alerted patrolling state is Q2. I removed the one that was previously called the frightened state, which was Q3. I removed this because it ended up being unnecessary to have that state involved. It ended up being pretty much the exact same as the alerted state in terms of transitions. So I removed it to kind of optimize the process. Q4 is still the fighting state when Batman's actually in line of sight of the enemies and they're currently firing or running at him to try to hit him, or depending on if they're armed or unarmed. And then Q5 is if Batman dies. All the other states here, this kind of like banana shape that I've got going on here, this is to every time an enemy is taken down, Q6 through Q13 here, evaluate how many enemies are remaining. And if there's 3 remaining, or no more, no less than 3 remaining, it'll spawn in 3 more enemies. So then this here, once Batman dies, it moves to Q3, which evaluates how many, or it doesn't evaluate how many, but it kind of resets the tape on the it resets the bottom tape, sorry, to be empty again, or not empty, but on an empty space. And then once it's on an empty space, it stays there, and then it goes to the final state. So an important thing to note that I didn't put in my notes here is the top tape operates on my input alphabet I previously showed. And the bottom tape operates on a very different alphabet. So top tape reads user input. Bottom tape. What the bottom tape does is an X equals a defeated enemy. And E equals a conscious enemy, or an undefeated enemy. Gosh, sorry, my phone just went off at that exact moment. It's not helpful. All right, so this is my bottom tape here. The top tape operates on this alphabet that I showed you previously in the slideshow. So without further ado, I will go ahead and test this. This popped up on my other monitor. All right, so an important thing to note that I will show you here, there's no enemies in the bottom tape by default. So an invalid string for this Turing machine will be, for instance, if you try to not spawn any enemies at the beginning. It'll start at Q17 here, which is an initial state that I added, making sure that at least one enemy gets spawned in. And if it doesn't, as you can see, the machine breaks. So that guarantees that there will be at least one enemy present and that Batman won't be in the room by himself right at the start. So now I will do the same input string, but with 4 spawns at the beginning. So this means that Batman will take down 2 enemies, or sorry, 1 enemy, and then it'll see that there's 3 left and spawn in 3 more, if this works correctly. So let's try it. So you can see the bottom tape here is spawning in enemies, which are showing up as E's. B, B, C, A. Then D is going to be the first input where an enemy is taken down by Batman. So now we're going to see what happens when that occurs. Now you can see that the E changed to an X here. And now it went down to Q6 because it's going to evaluate, okay, how many enemies are remaining in the bottom tape. And you can see it kind of scrolls through, sees that it stops. And then it's going to write a new enemy onto the bottom tape when it sees a box or sorry, it's going to move to the right when it, oh, I was thinking of the wrong thing. Sorry. It spawns in more enemies when there's 2 remaining, not 3. So I go to another D here. There's an enemy taken down. So we have 2 X's, 2 E's. Now we're going to step. It sees that it hits a box here. So it's going to write a new enemy. And it's going to write a new enemy in here. So now there's 3 enemies remaining. So now it's going to scroll back to the beginning. So as you can see, it's keeping track of all the X's on the far right side and all the E's on the far left. So E is another enemy being taken down. So we'll scroll through that again. It's again seeing that it only found 2 E's on the bottom and it hit another box. So it's going to spawn in another enemy there, and it's going to move back this way. It's going to see that it hits an X, and it's going to backtrack onto the E. The reason for this being, I wanted it to backtrack off of the X's so that if an enemy is already taken down, like I don't want the machine to do anything else with that, right? So that way, all these will be intact at the end, and we'll be able to see how many enemies Batman took down. F is another enemy being taken down. So you can see it'll spawn in another one. It'll move back just like it did before. Then finally, G is the input in which Batman is defeated. So now it's going to go through. It'll evaluate. I have it moved to the right on the bottom tape when G is input from any state. When G's input, it moves to the X's so that it can then. This is to kind of simulate it counting it, but it doesn't really count it because I couldn't figure out a good way to do that. Maybe in a future iteration if I try to go farther and more detailed with this. But this was something I had a lot of fun making. It was fun to kind of expand on what I had going before, and I would like to find a way to make this in more in depth and more detailed. Maybe with more time and if I had less going on. But I would like to thank you all for listening, watching, whatever. And I hope you all have a good one. Thanks.